and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. My name is Elliot Waldman, and I'm an associate editor here at WPR. Before we dive into today's interview, just a quick reminder to tune in again on Friday for our editor's discussion looking at the week's top headlines. Last week, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the UN body entrusted with verifying Iran's compliance with the 2015 nuclear agreement, reported that Iran is accelerating its production of enriched uranium. It was just the latest in an apparent push by Tehran to breach the nuclear agreement after the Trump administration withdrew from the accord in 2018 and reimposed devastating sanctions on the Iranian economy. But last week's announcement marked a new milestone. For the first time in years, Iran possesses enough enriched uranium to manufacture a nuclear weapon. Experts now estimate that should the country's leaders choose to do so, it could have a nuclear weapon in 3 to 4 months. This comes at a time of domestic upheaval in Iran, as authorities struggle to contain an outbreak of the novel coronavirus disease known as COVID-19, and also as parliamentary elections last month strengthened the hand of conservative and hardline political factions in Tehran. Tensions with the United States, meanwhile, remain high even as the two sides have backed off from the brink of war since last month. The recent news of Iran ramping up its nuclear program, however, could cause tensions to spike yet again. Joining us now to help unpack all of this is Dina Esfandiari. She's a fellow at the Century Foundation, where her research focuses on Persian Gulf security, Iran's foreign relations, and general security issues across the Middle East. Dina, welcome to Trendlines.
Thank you for having me.
So first things first, how do you read the recent moves by Iran to increase its stockpile of enriched uranium? What message is it trying to send?
Well, it's pretty consistent with what the Iranians have been doing over the course of the last year and a bit since President Trump announced that he was going to walk away from the 2015 nuclear deal. At first, Iran spent a year waiting to see whether it would be able to get some of the dividends of the deal that it was promised from the remaining states party to the agreement. And after a year, when it found that it wasn't, and that it wasn't getting the sanctions relief that was promised, it decided to ramp up its activities, both nuclear and non-nuclear. On the nuclear front, it went through a very slow, measured, reversible number of steps that it pre-announced before it actually took them. And each step was Iran effectively downgrading its commitment to the deal. And each of these were intended to give the other states party to the deal a warning and let them know that Iran was going to do this in a certain amount of time, giving them that little window of opportunity to do something in order to ensure that Iran didn't do it. And what was that something? Well, to be honest, it could have been anything that Iran was originally promised in the actual nuclear agreement. And when the Europeans and the remaining states parties were not able to deliver on some of those promises, then Iran took the measure that it promised it would take. Today, it has officially returned to the status it had prior to the nuclear agreement. So the breakout time, as you mentioned in your introduction, is about 3 to 4 months. Now, this doesn't mean that Iran is 3 to 4 months away from a bomb. It just means that Iran has the raw materials it needs, and it would need 3 to 4 months to put those together if it then had the delivery mechanism that it would then be able to put it into that and have a nuclear weapon, which, of course, at the moment, it doesn't have.
Given all that's happened, have we seen any inclination at all or any sign from the Trump administration that it's likely to budge from its so-called maximum pressure strategy?
It seems to me as though the Trump administration believes that its strategy is working. When you look at it from outside, however, it isn't working. We had an Iran that was compliant to the nuclear agreement, that had somewhat calmed down some of its activities in the region. And today we have the opposite. We have an Iran that is almost no longer bound to the nuclear agreement, and has ramped up a lot of what it has been doing in the region over the course of the last, 8 to 10 months or so. So to me, it doesn't look like maximum pressure is working. The problem is that there doesn't seem to be an off-ramp for either Iran or the US. The US seems dead set on continuing its maximum pressure strategy. They think the pressure is working, and they look at economic figures in Iran that are, yes, in free fall at the moment. Iran is really struggling economically, and for them, that is success. For me, however, that isn't, because it's not really achieving what we want it to achieve. If the idea is to contain Iran, well, Iran isn't contained. If the idea is to ensure Iran returns to the negotiating table, well, Iran is refusing to do that while it's under pressure. If the idea is for Iran to continue implementing the nuclear deal, well, clearly it's not doing that. And if the idea is to change the government in Iran, well, that's also becoming increasingly difficult because you're effectively unifying the system in Iran in the face of external adversity. So it doesn't look to me like maximum pressure is working. And from Tehran's perspective, they cannot be seen to capitulate and come to the negotiating table at a time when they're being squeezed by the US in this way. Because the message that sends is, if we do this today, then any other time when Tehran poses a problem to any other country, all they then have to do is squeeze it to the point where the Iranians give in. So, from the perspective of a policymaker in Tehran, that would be absolutely ludicrous. So, they're not going to budge until the Trump administration offers them some kind of off ramp or some kind of carrot that would bring them to the negotiating table.
You mentioned earlier the remaining signatories to the nuclear deal, which are Russia, China, and the 3 European countries that signed on: France, Germany, and the UK. Those countries have said that they will try to keep the deal together, but do they actually have any recourse to keep it from falling apart entirely?
The Europeans, for their part, are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. It's increasingly difficult for them to do anything serious that would ensure that Iran stays within the deal. They had a window of opportunity to help perhaps contain Trump's maximum pressure campaign. That didn't work. And they tried to put in place a number of measures, things like the payment system that was called Instex. The idea behind that was to help facilitate payments for the transfer of goods and trade with Iran. But it was very difficult for that to actually work out in the end, because the Trump administration kept saying that they would sanction, the leadership of Instex, for example. And the Europeans didn't really want to challenge those threats. They could have, but ultimately they didn't really do that. Not least of all because Iran is perhaps not as important to the Europeans as their relationship with the US, which I guess is a fair call. The Russians and the Chinese, however, they have also been disappointing in terms of the efforts that they put into ensuring the continued implementation of the deal. And the reason for that is Russia and China can more or less continue to deal with Iran in a manner that they were doing before the nuclear deal, even during the nuclear deal, and now in the beginning of the post-nuclear deal phase. They are not really bound by US sanctions. China, for example, continued to import oil from Iran. It would go through ups and downs, but largely it continued to import Iranian oil and to trade with Iran. And so for them, while they are committed to ensuring that Iran doesn't develop a nuclear weapon, and so that the non-proliferation benefits of the deal are upheld, they aren't as bothered about ensuring that they're upheld through the nuclear deal. And they're also frustrated with the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, and have their own problems with the Trump administration, which once again relegates the Iran issue kind of to the back of the line.
Iran has been suffering quite a bit from the sanctions that the U.S. reimposed, and just this week we saw oil prices fall pretty dramatically. Does that mean it's going to have an even harder time keeping its economy afloat?
So Iran is having a very, very rough time, to put it mildly. Having said that, I'm not sure that the tumbling of oil prices is going to have that much of an effect on Iran, given that Iran is already not exporting much of its oil. China has been dropping its imports of oil, and Iran isn't really sending it to many others. There was some sale of oil through some of the black kind of oil market and underground market into Iraq and things like that. That those might be affected, but I think it's marginal. I think ultimately Iran is just generally struggling quite a bit economically, and the sanctions have really had a severe impact on Iran's ability to continue trading, to boost its trade, and to kind of get itself out of international isolation. Having said that, Tehran has also made it a point to put in place what it has called a economy of resistance. Tehran has learned its lesson. It is not planning on relying on foreigners anytime soon. And I think that that's what this economy of resistance does. The plan is to ensure that its economy is now diversified away from oil, that it is doing a little bit more in manufacturing, that it's boosting different sectors. And the idea is that this will ultimately make Iran more self-sufficient. And we have seen an improvement in certain areas and examples of what Iran is able to achieve even under stringent sanctions. For example, its aerospace and missile industry has done actually quite well for a country that's been under sanctions for so long.
Huh. How is that able to happen? Where are they getting their supplies from if these sanctions are choking off sources of imports?
Well, some of those imports were happening either before the sanctions or even while under sanctions through the black markets, through illicit networks. And then a lot of it has been Iran just learning from some of the systems that it either had access to in the past and upgrading them, or copying systems that it has managed to acquire throughout the years. So it has improved its ability to just develop new technologies. Its drone program is a pretty advanced program as well. And so it has been able to achieve quite a lot, but ultimately, in terms of its economic well-being, today it's really struggling.
Given that backdrop, it was probably the last thing that Iran wanted to become a focal point in the global COVID-19 epidemic, and yet we see that happening. And the number of cases are reportedly more numerous than what reports would suggest officially. How does this situation figure into the recent actions that Iran has taken with its nuclear program, for example?
I mean, it's undeniable that the outbreak of coronavirus has been a real slap in the face for Iran, and this at a time where it's already struggling quite significantly. It doesn't help that Iranian officials have dealt with this quite poorly. There is underreporting of the number of cases. They have reportedly, or they did in fact, keep the outbreak quiet for a couple of days because it occurred in the lead up to the parliamentary elections, and so they didn't want to run the risk that they would have low turnout at the parliamentary elections. It was important for them to maintain this veneer of legitimacy through voter turnout. And so they kept it quiet, and then they have been dealing with it quite poorly at the moment. And in fact, it has been Iran's relatively advanced healthcare professionals and healthcare system that actually has stepped up and kind of filled the gap where Iranian officials weren't very good with dealing with the outbreak. What has been interesting is what you mentioned, is the fact that a lot of Iranian officials were contaminated, and that this was made very public by the government. I think that that's interesting because normally you would expect that this kind of thing also to be kept quiet. I guess it would show a sign of weakness, but it seems that the Iranian system decided to make this incredibly public and to really drive the point home. The reason for that is, I think what they're trying to do is show a domestic audience that, look, we the elite, we are just like you. We are affected by these things like you are, and we as a nation will be fighting this together. And this in the backdrop of Iran being squeezed increasingly by the U.S. And by others. So I think it's very important for them to have this show of unity as a result of this pandemic that's hit them pretty hard. And this is why they're making these public announcements about their officials also getting affected.
I want to shift to talk about Iran's posture in the region, because there's been a lot written about what the impact might be of the top Iranian military commander Qasem Soleimani being killed by the U.S. earlier this year in a drone strike near Baghdad. How has that had an impact on Iran's activities in the region, for example, its aid to Shiite militias in Iraq and Hezbollah in Lebanon?
So, the first thing to talk about here is to unpack a little bit what the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and the Quds Force, which Qasem Soleimani led, is supposed to be doing. The Revolutionary Guards were created after the revolution, the Iranian Revolution in 1979. The idea was that the new government in Iran didn't really trust the armed forces that had worked under the Shah, and so they created their own force. So the idea was this would protect the revolution both domestically and in the region and internationally, which is where the Quds Force comes in. Over the course of the next 30, 40 years, what the force did under Qasem Soleimani's leadership, and this was really his vision, was to establish a network of friendships, partnerships, alliances with non-state groups in the region. The idea was that as a country that was increasingly isolated, where no state would want to work with it, it would reach out to friendly groups in the region and work with them both to initially spread the revolution, defend minorities, but the idea was eventually that it would increase its influence in the region in that way. And today, the Iranians believe, and somewhat correctly, that this has been an incredibly successful system that was implemented in the region. Iran has reach throughout the region in a way that no other country has been able to replicate over the course of the last, however many years. So the establishment of this system is key for the continuation of Iran's influence and strength and power projection in the region. Now, Qasem Soleimani was the very public face of the Revolutionary Guards abroad, and he was a controversial figure. He was both disliked and loved by Iranians. They both disliked what he did in the region, particularly in Syria, didn't really understand why Iran was so overtly present outside its borders at a time where it's going through so much upheaval inside the country. But he was also loved for what he did in terms of defending Iran's borders from hostile powers in the region, and in particular from ISIS when it came pretty close to the Iranian border, and in fact managed to attack Iran itself. So he was a controversial figure, but Iranians did respect him very much for what he did. What he did do that wasn't great for Iran was that he also increased the visibility of Iran's presence in the region. And that is what has led to some of the protests that we have seen in Lebanon and in Iraq over the course of the last few months. Now, both of those protest movements have serious and legitimate local grievances that need addressing, but Iran's association with these non-state groups in each country, these groups that have made the situation worse for both of those countries, Iran has basically guilty by association. And so a lot of the protests that have been happening both in Lebanon and in Iraq have targeted Iran and the Quds Force. So that kind of shows that while Qasem Soleimani was a visionary and a very important person in putting this system in place, there was a certain amount of either intentional or unintentional overreach. So the fact that he's now gone provides Tehran with an opportunity to revisit, at the very least, the visibility of its presence in the region. And I think we're starting to see that a little bit. The person that was appointed to take over from him is somebody that is not as public, as charismatic, as well known. He's a quiet figure. He knows the system relatively well.
He was previously Soleimani's deputy, right?
That's right, exactly. So he knows both the Quds Force and what the Quds Force is trying to achieve in the region pretty well. But he doesn't have the relationships that Qasem Soleimani had. That is undeniable. And I think that, for example, he doesn't even speak Arabic in the way that Qasem Soleimani did, which facilitated a lot of his interactions in the region. So basically, Qasem Soleimani was an important man. He's left big shoes to fill, but he is not irreplaceable the Revolutionary Guards are a huge system, both domestically and internationally. And there may be a period where they're still trying to figure out what they're going to do, but Iran will be keen to show continuity and keen to show that it's back to business as usual now.
So it will continue to support these groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and militias in Iraq, but do so in a quieter way and cover its tracks a little bit more?
I mean, that, if I was sitting in Tehran, yes, that would be the thing to do. Clearly, what hasn't worked out in its favor is its perceived sectarianism in its dealings with some of these groups in the region, and what these groups have then done in their own domestic constituencies. So what would make sense for them would be to return to what they did so well at the beginning, which was kind of calling the shots from behind, without being as visible as they are today. It remains to be seen whether they're willing to do that to begin with. I mean, after all, remember that after Qasem Soleimani's assassination, there was a press conference with the commander of the IRGC, and he came out in front of 16 flags, and these 16 flags represented the different groups that Iran was dealing with in the region, almost visibly creating a link between Tehran and these groups in a way that had never been done before. So it remains to be seen whether Iran will try to walk that back a little bit, but I suspect that we will see no change in how much Iran is involved abroad. Where we may see change is how visible that involvement is.
Shifting back to domestic politics in Iran, the country held parliamentary elections last month, which saw big victories for conservatives and hardline factions. What does that tell us about the directions Iran's foreign policy and national security strategy is likely to take in the near future? Should we expect the regime to put even more emphasis on its nuclear program, or perhaps even engage in other kinds of provocations?
So before we go into that, it's important to highlight that the reason that we saw big sweeping victories for some of the more hardline candidates in Iran's parliamentary elections is because before the elections happened, there is a body in Tehran that basically agrees to the candidates that are then able to present themselves at the elections. That means that we usually get much higher numbers of candidates from across the political spectrum that register to run in the elections, but this body then disqualifies a big number of them.
You're referring to the Guardian Council?
That's correct, yes. And so the Guardian Council this time around disqualified almost all the candidates that were even remotely considered more moderate in their political views, which meant that we ended up with only hardliners running in these elections. So it was inevitable that they were going to really win a big chunk of the parliamentary seats. Now, what does that mean for Iran's future? Well, it's pretty consistent with what we've been seeing over the course of the last couple of years, where the more hardline elements of the system have been consolidating themselves after a period where they were kind of thrown into disarray following President Rouhani's election victories. Today, they've emerged stronger. They've emerged also stronger because they are able to stand up to President Rouhani, who hasn't really delivered on many of his campaign promises. Some not his fault, of course. The nuclear deal wasn't really his fault. He actually delivered on it. It just didn't pan out the way that people expected. And so they have a real platform to stand on and campaign. It also means that it's probably increasingly likely that they are going to slowly take over all of the levers of power in Iran. And I hate predicting things in Iran because things never turn out the way that we expect them to. But I think it's likely that there is going to be a hardliner that will win the presidential elections coming up soon. So they are going to slowly take control of all of the levers of powers. Now, what does that mean? That means that, ironically, they will be under less pressure domestically to kind of prove their point, giving them a little bit of freedom, a little bit of respite from the internal domestic infighting, which means that they could actually loosen up a couple of things or pass through some token reforms to address some of the discontent in Iran. Now, it's also possible that if they control all the levers of power, they'll feel stronger, and so they won't hesitate to crack down if there is further discontent in Iran. It really remains to be seen how they react. But what is key is that if hardliners in Iran grab control of all of the levers of power and stay in control of them for the foreseeable future, then this presents an interesting opportunity for them to start thinking about and to start putting their candidates in place for the next supreme leader. The current supreme leader is ill and is getting on a little bit, and so I think that there's a lot of thought being put into the person that will replace him. And if hardliners control everything in Iran, then they're likely to get a greater say, which means that they would effectively be setting the terms for the future of the Islamic Republic. And that is what's a little bit scary.
You mentioned the upcoming presidential election in 2021 and also the succession race for the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. What other flashpoints or important events do you have on the horizon that you'll be watching for how all this unfolds?
I think the main flashpoint to look out for in the next few months is actually, it will occur in October 2020. So that is when the UN boycott on Iranian arms trades should be lifted as a result of the successful implementation of the nuclear deal. Now, the US has said that given where we are today, they will absolutely not allow that boycott to be lifted. This is something that Iran was really building towards. And now, given how much Iran has downgraded its implementation of the nuclear deal, even the Europeans, who were somewhat on Iran's side as a result of everything that has happened, they are now facing a difficult situation where they cannot possibly accept the boycott being lifted at a time where Iran is downgrading its implementation of the nuclear deal and acting out quite aggressively in the region. So I think that will be a significant flashpoint. It will be interesting to see how the Iranians will react, but I suspect that they will come down hard if that boycott is not lifted. And if they do, that might look like the end of the nuclear deal for good, but even an Iran walking away from the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, which would be a lot more concerning.
Dina, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Dina Esfandiari is a fellow at the Century Foundation. Her research focuses on the Persian Gulf, Iran's foreign relations, and security issues across the Middle East. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and WPR on Twitter. And while you're at it, don't forget to sign up for our free daily newsletter. It's the best way to keep up with what we're publishing, and you'll also get a code for a 25% discount off an annual subscription. To sign up, go to wpr.pub/trendlines. That's wpr.pub/trendlines. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.